Happy Pride Month! Queens Public Library continues its ongoing commitment to promote queer liberation and representation across our borough and beyond. Whether you're looking for books and resources, engaging in inclusive programs, or just seeking a welcoming space, we are here for you. Come on by and let us know what's your query. For more information, visit queenslib.org/Pride 2023. Summer reading kicks off this month. Visit summerreading.queenslibrary.org for our full summer reading program schedule, book lists for all ages, and other resources to keep your kids engaged and learning all summer long. Juneteenth celebrates the end of slavery in the United States. Check out our reading lists and join us for a wide range of programs to learn more about this important day in U.S. history. Visit our website for more information.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I'm Christopher Galarza, Queens Public Library's Community Health Coordinator. Today, we welcome back Sharice Francis for our final installment of our monthly workshop series, where we read and discuss excerpts from essays and generate written work based on prompts inspired by the memoir anthology, You Are Your Best Thing, Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Based on the quotation from Toni Morrison's Beloved, how can we see ourselves as our own best thing? How does living in our truth give us the breathing room to be our full selves? We'll be deep diving into various themes like vulnerability, family, healing, spirituality, social and institutional oppressions, art, and memory. And without further ado, Sharice, please take it away.
Thank you, Christopher. And welcome to the final workshop called Choreographing Our Best Selves. We'll be reading an essay from Imani Perry called To You, Vulnerable Mother, a choreo essay. So before we start reading her essay, I just want to share this pic to kind of introduce how we can choreograph our best selves. This is an image I found depicting Sethi's scar from the book Beloved. And I wanted to point out this because in the book, different characters describe her scars differently. And Sethi received this scarring when she was whipped for trying to prevent her children from being taken away while she was enslaved. And so she had those scars for years, and basically she became numb to those scars. She didn't have any feeling in her back. But I thought it was interesting that throughout the book, um, different characters interpreted her scars differently. So there was a character who's a white woman, I think her name's Amy, and she describes her scar as a choke cherry tree, which you can see at the side is a picture of. And then Paul D, during an intimate moment with Sethi in the book, describes her scar as this kind of wrought iron design, kind of like a gate that you can see at the side here. And I think it's interesting that the two different characters interpreted her scars differently. And when we're thinking about how we look at our own bodies and how we interpret symptoms and signs of our own bodies, of each other's bodies, it's important to keep in mind how we each interpret that differently, and to think about that in terms of larger wellness and health. So, to begin, to you, vulnerable mother, a choreo essay, Imani Perry. My life seems to be an increasing revelation of the intimate face of universal struggle. You begin with your family and the kids on the block, and next you open your eyes to what you call your people, and that leads you into land reform, into Black English, into Angola, leads you back to your own bed where you lie by yourself, wondering if you deserve to be peaceful or trusted or desired, or left to the freedom of your own unfaltering heart. And the scale shrinks to the size of a skull, your own interior cage. June Jordan, Some of Us Did Not Die, new and selected essays. When did you begin to awaken with a swollen face? I mean the one that is not the result of a cold or hours of weeping, the one that is your earned face. Worry makes it mark. If not there, in the steady ache between your shoulder blades, a steady headache, the corn worried to red on white atop your right third toe, you sigh unexpectedly and often. I started this piece with June Jordan, a habit of mine, because she grants me remarkable confidence and because she could tell a world in a paragraph. The intimate face of the universal struggle blooms when we come of age. We all love hopefully hard, the kind of love that cannot be destroyed. We fear death, we hate heartbreak, we work too hard and rest too infrequently. Those are near universal things, but it can get more challenging still. Some terms are harder to live with. According to identity, responsibility, and experience, the universal struggle sometimes has a starker and harsher expression. I know that June Jordan was talking to me, a Black woman, worrying about her family and the kids on the block, and the people and the prisons. Sometimes I have read people use the second person instead of I when they are talking about something that is especially painful because it is less frightening if you distance yourself from it. Perhaps that's what I just did, but I hope that it also works as a way to reach across me to you, reader. I hope that in the way that the epigraph above hit me rang loudly inside my head when I read the words, that when you read you, you saw you and me, and maybe a you and me that both of us find difficult to face and even harder to forget. Vulnerable people, I have read, are defined by being susceptible to physical or emotional attack or injury. If you are a person whose very body marks you as deserving of disregard or as available for violence, you are vulnerable no matter how strong or smart you are. And so I wonder, why don't we always call being Black in the United States being vulnerable? It is inarguably so. I am a Black mother, and if you are like me, you may have played with doll babies for long hours as a child. You tended them with care. You rocked or shaked the baby gently, soothing in the way you saw your own caretakers do. Sometimes you fussed at your children, but you picked them up and kissed their plastic cheeks. You sewed dresses with big uneven stitches and regretted cutting off their waxy curls. You never once doubted that your attentiveness and sweet love was more than enough for your babies. Your confidence was remarkable. But you had to grow up. We grew up, and as we grew up and became real mothers, so much was eked away that we grew with each season of life more aware of the precarity of our tasks. Black mothers' vulnerability is particular, and inside that specific reality, that ambiguous word vulnerable collides against itself. Because vulnerable also means that you are subject to higher penalties for every misdeed, every failure. But also vulnerable means that you need special care and protection because you're susceptible to physical or emotional attack or injury. Here's the tension. If I reveal my anguish, my human errors are exposed, judged, evaluated, and punished, with little hope for sensitivity. Empathy, writ large, is reserved for other types of people, less vulnerable ones. Empathy is often shaped by white supremacy. It glides over us, rarely resting long enough to witness our humanness. I tell you a few stories to make things clearer. Once upon a time, there was a mother and a child. The mother read stories to her son each night. She gave him plenty of hugs and warm baths. She joined the PTA when he began school. It was that year that his breathing became labored, strained, terrifyingly vulnerable. The big stone schoolhouse was a sick building. Poison radiated from it because who cares much about schools for children like him? And she would run from work every time he struggled, and she missed work and was punished, then fired for tardiness and absences. And he missed school and faced the consequences for tardiness and absences. And when they weren't around, the people talked about what a shame it was that neither fulfilled their promise. And as soon as there were so many things to worry about, that the nighttime stories had no magic and were set aside, and the hugs grew rare, feeling desperate rather than sweet. Once upon a time, there was a mother and a child. The mother had scaled every professional height. She kept things precise. Excellence was her brand and promotion. The daughter was smart and gregarious and the apple of the mother's eye, but too much for a Black girl in the eyes of many. Pricks of envy turned to sniping. The girl grew embarrassed. How could she tell her mother so precise how much she was failing at staying in her place? Loneliness stuck in her craw. Ugliness stared back at her from the mirror in their eyes. Soon her spirit was cracked. The mother watched, castigated, encouraged, implored until she too began to see the failure in the mirror. The one thing that mattered most was her greatest inadequacy, motherhood. Once upon a time, there was a mother who slipped away in mind but not body. There was a child who tried to mother her. The child cooked, the child cleaned, the child adored. The mother, having been hungry her whole life, ate at the child's grateful but selfish. The child, hungry her whole life, looked for someone, anyone to hear their loneliness of song. You can find them now, swimming upstream against the tide of neglect, with hope waning, but hoping still. Maybe you felt the stories, or you heard their melodies. Cage birds sing the most beautiful song. Paul Laurence Dunbar told us so, but they also pace and peck. Watch them. Sometimes their habits look frenetic. Sometimes they are so still you wonder, do animals get bored? Or is that bird still alive? A jolt and they startle, like you do when you have a terrible flashback. Some might think the cage bird sings because it has the gift of transcendence, or simply because it is beautiful. Grace is a truer word. Grace is not, however, enough when it has to be enough. I mean, really, we can praise it all we want, but will anybody open the door? Inside my own interior cage, the one June Jordan told me about, I peer at my swollen face. I feel around for my heart. Underneath the racing, it often aches. There is so much to be concerned with, so much beyond control, so much that is worrisome, so much that cannot be changed. Vulnerable parents raise vulnerable children, children who step out from under our embrace and face the slings and arrows without us. They are pierced, they have watched us and learned to cleverly cover our wounds. To laugh or lash at them because vulnerable means subject to higher penalties or deserving of disregard. Weak is something we curl our lips at. What a terrible thing to do when nurture is the appropriate response. And what a lesson to our young. If they learn that lesson too well, we teach them how not to ask when they need help. And therefore, we cannot give them the special care and protection they need and deserve because they are too vulnerable, masquerading as invulnerable. What a cruel choreography. The sociologists and social critics, not all but many, will tell you about cycles that must be broken. They mean the sociological things like poverty, prison, employment, disease, premature birth and death, violence, and homelessness. And they will tell you that breaking the cycle is our duty, especially the duty of mothers. And they never flinch or hesitate or let their mouths tremble before the ugliness spilling out of them. They never ask themselves, how is it that I keep telling the vulnerable to not be vulnerable? How is it that I fasten my eyes to write down even more judgment on top of judgment and will not acknowledge the mounds on her back that threaten to bury her? Even seeds need water and air that can be reached. The sharply worded assessment is written again and again. Black women have too much, more than anyone else, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Black women have strokes, chlamydia, syphilis, HIV, and hypertension. They give birth to babies who weigh too little and die too frequently, more than anyone else. The data say we die more than other women from the worst of these. The data say we and our children carry too much flesh and too much fat. I hate these statistics. I hate that they're real evidence. But what I hate even more is that they are so often presented without context. And by context, I mean the culture and values that shape our lives. They are, in fact, secondary details to a primary truth about the world and the way it treats us. I would like another set of facts. I would like a visual constellation of the thousands of stressors electrifying our brains every day. I would like a map of the mundane experience of defeat in love, in work, in housing, in caretaking. I would like a list of obstacles before us. I would like someone to draw us standing before the mountain barefoot, slew-footed, and sleep-deprived, expected to climb. I want a more honest rendering. I want gentle eyes. That is a first step. I have no pep talk to offer because such words only crush you when they falter. You can do it, right before you couldn't. I felt the crush myself. Instead, my words to myself and to us, to you, are tenderness, warning, and warming. You simply cannot be kind to yourself and also accept the structure and judgment of a racist and sexist society. These days, you hear a lot of talk about self-care. I'm telling you that there is an indispensable tool, a necessary part of self-care that cannot be left out. The tool is refusing to accept the terms of a world that builds you into it as vulnerable, and that goes for parenting and protecting as well. We bemoan what we don't have, we can and should decry what is unfair and what hurts. But the moment we turn on ourselves, we have chosen cruelty over love. As we prepare our children for this world, our challenging task sits at the crossroads of vulnerability that we ourselves never get to stop managing. We know the risk of sharing our tears, of admitting weakness. We also know, or ought to know, that if we prepare our children with the lesson that we are teaching them to beat their chest when weeping is more appropriate, to swallow fear when screaming is necessary. And even if we never say it, our examples can be violent. Letting them be fully human can be scary, but it is necessary. Letting ourselves be fully human feels like it is against the rules. I kindly say in response, fuck the rules, be free. I think, and I say think because I will not pretend to know a world that doesn't yet exist, that the lessons we have to teach ourselves is how to do caretaking without denying our vulnerability and even our weaknesses and failability. This is what I take Jordan to mean when she speaks of revelation. We have to be naked with our failures and shame and ask our loved ones to help us stand up and grow through them. And this task is probably hardest when it comes to our children's vulnerability. It tears at us. If you ever seen a mother lash out at a child, you've probably seen a mother who's convulsing with self-loathing over having to stand before her child inadequate. You've probably seen a mother who has chosen to wound rather than to be naked because she thinks that is what the child needs. If you've seen a mother layering thick guilt on her child's spirit, I think you've probably seen a mother who's terrified that her failure has cost her the greatest love of her life, the one from her child. If that mother is you, you're not alone. If that mother sees you seeing her, show her another way. Build something else with her. Easier said than done. Anyone who's been through therapy knows that feeling at the end of the 50 minutes when your life stands in tatters, spread out everywhere, and you are charged with walking out and back into regular life. It is terrifying. As much as the discipline of therapeutic practice has its virtues, the vulnerability of exposure is real. We need more than 15 minutes. We also need daily ritual. We need held hands. We need common purpose. We need a cloud of loving witnesses for you, for your babies, for me, for mine. Someone must share not only the burden, but also the climb. You know how it says in the Bible, where two or more are gathered? I do not believe that is a statement that is solely or even primarily about church. I believe it is about the essential requirement of community. When you stand in community, you begin with a basic question: who am I? That's a fraught and dangerous task, as everything else for a vulnerable woman. Can you define yourself in a way that have little, if anything, to do with how you're placed in society, but everything should do with what you like, who you love, what makes you laugh, what rocks your spirit, what leaves you satisfied? Can you notice your feelings without judgment? Can you use them as information without layering on evaluation? Can you think about the things that make you and your loved ones, especially your children, beautiful, sweet, joyful, without putting them in comparison to others? Can you decide this all matters? Can we, please, together? In this task, you let go. You let go of the trivial things that you believe offer you an advantage in this world, and of the things, big things that threaten to swallow you up. Those sizes are not my judgment, but our doing. I didn't make up the habits. I'm just calling it out how I see it. Risky business, I know, but there's a risk in every virtue. Let's risk together. This is what Tarana Burke, my friend and our editor, taught me, that the way to risk enough to share the intimate face of universal struggle, universal truth, is to risk together. Where two or more are gathered, the moments of plaintive moaning are backed by melody. Breaks in the tune are what we call in Black music worrying the line. Worrying the line is a phrase for when the expected tune is disrupted. Sometimes the worrying break is a holler, sometimes it's a shout, sometimes it reaches towards the sky, and sometimes it's heavy and full-bodied. June Jordan said that there are two ways to worry words. One is hoping for the greatest possible beauty in what is created. The other is to tell the truth. I choose to give over to my worrying, to this kind that we need. Not a vanity and not a judgment. If you shout, I plan to come running and not alone. I plan to pry apart the gates of that interior cage and grab you up in an embrace. Me too, for me too. So that's a powerful essay from Imani Perry. And so to think about Imani Perry's essay further, I wanted to talk about rememory, a word that was created by Toni Morrison, and the idea of relating that to also diagnostics. And throughout Imani Perry's essay, I felt that the entire essay was a form of self-diagnostics, of her being intimate with her own body enough to know how to read the signs and markings of her own body, and how to use that as a entry point for her own healing. So to define rememory, this is how Toni Morrison defined it. It was recollecting and remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past. And I like this definition because it makes the idea of the body just not only a kind of personal physical body, but also a community and social body as well. And I wanted to include this quote from Body Marks of the Past in Toni Morrison's A Mercy and Home by Agnes Sophia Kovacs. In her critical writings, Toni Morrison often discusses diverse linguistic performances of race. There are two interconnected areas of this interest in language and race. One is the focus on the phenomena of race talk in language performance, while the other is the continued engagement with the historical and literary representations of race relations, often referred to by her notion of rememory. The acts of rememory in language use, however, poses the question of the relations among the subject of memory, the one who remembers, the object of memory that triggers this process, and the medium that is used for representing the acts of memory. And I pointed out this quote because I want to reference back to the scar on Sethi's back, and how in Toni Morrison's writing, Toni Morrison, when she talks about race, is often not interested in this kind of performative idea of how we talk about race that never really gets to the root of what's going on, the root of people's pain and their hurt and their vulnerability. And through rememory, specifically through the description of Sethi's scar, it's the object of the scar and Paul D touching her scar that reactivates all those trauma memories for Sethi, and but also begins a kind of entry point and gateway for her own healing, which is why I think it's interesting that Paul D describes her scar as a kind of gate and not a tree, that it's an entryway for her healing instead of uh, a wound that is just growing into a bigger wound. In the same essay, Agnes also brings up the term sense memory, which is also called affective memory. And sense memory is a technique that is also used in acting and performance studies. And it's the use of physical sensations and emotions to recall certain events in memory. So, as I mentioned, with Paul D touching Sethi's scar and her body, it triggers memories in her, and that kind of sense memory in the form of touching the body and kind of self-diagnosing through the touch of the body and reading the symbols and markings of the body. And it's through the body we can cultivate and process and map out our various memories as well. And then I also wanted to bring up another interpretation of sense memory from Marianne Hirsch, and she extends it beyond just our personal bodies to also the material other material items that can get passed down through our cultures that are also marked with memory as well and marked with communication as well, and how they move across time and space and across generations, and how that can affect how we see ourselves, how we identify, and how it shapes our experiences as well. And I also relate that to things like complex PTSD, which is a newer form of PTSD that gets described where it's not a singular event that is triggering, but it's a series of events that continues and repeats, and it can even continue and repeat across generations. And that PTSD can affect you even from past generations. And this relates to epigenetics as well, that traumatic experiences across generations can end up shaping someone's genetics, and those genetics can be passed on to later generations. And another term called vicarious trauma by Monica Williams, where um, experiencing trauma by other people, even if it's not directly impacting your own body, can still affect your own body, because your body can't tell the difference between trauma that is real for your body and trauma that is technically just you witnessing it or even fictionalized. And this is another quote about sense memory from Marian Hirsch. And I won't read the quote, but it talks about memory and post memory. And Marian Hirsch talks about the difference between rememory, where it's just the memories that are conjured up from that triggering of sense memory, versus post memory, where post memory is a kind of mediation through various objects um, that are passed down through generations. So her example was in the Holocaust, um, people who were marked while they were imprisoned in the ghettos or the concentration camps, those markings were seen by their children, and the children of the people who directly experienced that also were traumatized by those markings as well. So, for example, one woman, she began to have like psychosomatic symptoms where she began scratching her wrist in a certain area. And she realized that she was scratching her wrist in a certain area because it was the same mark that her mother had. And so that memory of the mark was also traumatizing her. And it goes back to similarly to Beloved in the book, where Sethi witnesses her mother's mark that she has on her breast. That is a circle with a cross inside. And Sethi's mother tells her that's a way of knowing it's her in case something happens to her. So as a character is traumatized by the the threat of losing her mother, but also the threat of not being able to mother her own child as well. And those two traumas of mothering that she has to deal with also reflects in the marks that are on her mother's body and also on her own body as well. So in thinking about the body in of itself, I wanted to bring up two people whose works I believe really think about the body and how we can think about the body differently than how Western culture has taught us to kind of disregard the body. So I wanted to bring up James Baldwin's word for sensuality. To be sensual, I think, is to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the breaking of bread. And then also Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. The erotic is a measure between the beginning of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an eternal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power in honor and self respect, we can require no less of ourselves. For as we begin to recognize our deepest feelings, we begin to give up out of necessity, being satisfied with suffering and self negation, and with the numbness which so often seems like their only alternative in our society. Our acts against oppression become integral with self, motivated and empowered from within. And I love these both of these ideas from James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, especially relating it to Sethi, because at the beginning of the book, Sethi is really numb to her pain, and it doesn't really allow her to be present in her life in a lot of ways, and she becomes very disconnected from herself. And through that, her intimate relationship with Paul D, she begins to start to unpack all of that trauma that she experienced. And the importance of feeling and learning to be present in those feelings, no matter what those feelings are, is a first step in being able to heal oneself from very traumatic experiences. This is another term that I wanted to bring up. Uh, this is a quote from Michael Foucault. In our societies, it is always the body that is at issue, the body and its forces, their utility and their docility, their distribution and their submission, but the body is also directly involved in a political field. Power relations have an immediate hold upon it. They invest in it, mark it, train it, torture it, force it to carry out tasks, to perform ceremonies, to emit signs. So that's a great quote from Michael Foucault, in thinking about how the body is not just personal to us, but the body is also involved in a political field and in various power relations as well. So in thinking about the body, it's not only just how we feel in our bodies, but also how we talk about our bodies and the words we create and the narratives we create to talk about our bodies, and how that also shapes how we interpret the signs and symptoms of our bodies as well. So I want to share this first prompt. What does my face and the marks on my body tell me? What does your intimate face of universal struggle reveal to you? What do the signs your body is communicating to you? What do these signs on your body reveal about you, your vulnerability in society, about the world? I'll give you a minute to begin writing a response. Okay, so I hope you were able to begin a response to this prompt. And I want to share another prompt. This is Once Upon a Time. Throughout Imani Perry's essay, she writes narratives through this trope of using once upon a time that we hear in fairy tales and stories as a way to begin to write about personal, even traumatic stories about herself or people she knows. So I would like for you to write about a specific struggle you are currently having through the second person point of view. What would you say about yourself? What narrative do you want to share about yourself? So the second person point of view is saying you instead of I. So I'll give you a minute to start writing a response to that as well. Okay, so I hope you were able to begin writing a response for this prompt, and let us continue. So, in thinking about um, rememory self diagnostics and how we read the body, I wanted to bring some terminologies up for body talk. So, in a lot of medical studies, soma is the word that's used for the body. So it's body in Greek, and sema is a word that is also from Greek, and it's the word for signs, marks, tokens, omen, portent, constellations, and even grave. And from soma, the word for body, we get words like somatics, which is the term coined by professor and theorist Thomas Hanna in 1976, and it represents a field of movement studies and body work that foregrounds the internal physical sensations, perceptions, and experiences of the body, and that's, of course, also related to sense memory. And from the word sema, the word for signs, we get words like semiotics, the study of signs and symbols and the use of it or interpretation. And we get word like semantics, the branch of linguistics and logic concerned with meaning. Now, with semiotics and semantics, they're usually in reference to literary studies. But since our bodies also have markings and symptoms, we also read our bodies in different ways as well. So I believe these terms can also apply to our bodies as well. And also, when thinking about the body, there's nonverbal communication. So much of our societies overemphasize um, verbal communication as the main way to communicate, but our bodies communicate in various ways as well. And there's some terminologies that are associated with that. Kinesics, the study of the way in which certain body movements and gestures serve as a form of nonverbal communication. So some types are idiokinesis, an approach to improving posture and alignment and fluency of movement through structured guided imagery. So this is back to semiotics and figurative language that we use, like metaphors. And there's also sociokinesis, which is the study of movement patterns of a group. There's kinesthetics, which is the study of body motions and one's perception of body motions. There's proprioception, perception or awareness of the position and movement of the body. And then there's also prosemics, the branch of knowledge that deals with the amount of space that people feel is necessary to set between themselves and others. And that's, of course, having to do with more social movement and not personal body movement. And of course, when we talk about the body, we also have to talk about genetics and social. And I mentioned earlier about epigenetics and how environmental influences affect the expression of genes and how that also shows up on our bodies. There's communal or social body and how social constructions like community influence the expressions and perceptions of our bodies. How we as a society define other people affects how they express themselves physically and also how they perceive their own bodies as well. And there's also haptic communication, a branch of nonverbal communication that refers to the ways in which people and animals communicate and interact via the sense of touch. So, touch is the most sophisticated and intimate of the five senses, and it's also one of the first senses to develop because it has to do with our entire bodies. So, with Imani Perry's essay, she called it a choreo essay. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Ntozake Shange and her terminology of choreo poetics. So I'll read this quote from Walking on the Edges of the Galaxy, Queer Choreo Poetic Thought in the African Diaspora by Mecca Jamila Sullivan. In her 1978 essay, Taking a Solo, A Poetic Possibility, A Poetic Imperative, Ntozake Shange interrogates literatures and criticism that submit to demands of racial representation over the possibilities of creative expression. Critiquing US literary culture's tendency to reward writers whose voices reinforce prefabricated models of Blackness, Shange observes that if you are a female and Black in the USA, you have one solitary voice. Though you number 3 million, no nuance exists for you. You have been sequestered in the monolith, the common denominator as a person. For Shange, the imperative of racial representation constrains the range and complexity of voices and identities that can be presented in Black literature, and seriously compromises literary conceptions of Black women's identity. In Shange's work, the choreo poem form emerges as one of many ways to bridge this chasm between representation and expressive nuance. Developed and named by Shange in her most famous work for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, the choreo poem instantiates a poetic melding of body and voice that allows Shange to probe what she calls elsewhere the meaning of a contradiction in anybody's body. By rendering body and voice inextricable components of creative expression, the choreo poem form allows Shange to write nuance back onto Black female bodies through the communicative properties of the body, including gesture, dance, movement, and color. For queer women writers of the diaspora, choreo-poetic thinking offers pathways for speaking oneself out of social structures that constrain the voice through willful misreadings of the body. Together, these two modes of nuance, Spiller's disallowed nuantial, which is a form of nuance, sexual and corporal subjectivity, and Shange's forbidden nuance of complex Black female voicing, demonstrate the need for new grammars, new forms of speaking, new forms of seeing, speaking, and signifying Black female sexuality and difference. Shange's innovation of the choreo poem offers such a form, a poetic form and mode of expression designed explicitly to represent the complexities of intersectional identity. Through the choreo poem, Shange develops what we might term a body language, a strategic means of describing the Black female body with new languages that both rewrite that body's meanings and expand the creative and conceptual terrains of which that body can speak. Body language allows Black women artists to articulate and emphasize the many meanings of their bodies, including the many identities those bodies signify. It also enables to create new formal modalities for inserting Black female intersectionality into discourses on identity and embodiment. Choreo-poetic thinking creates similar opportunities for healing and transformation in literature. They serve as poetic instantiations of what Sherry Moraga terms theory in the flesh, in which the physical reality of our lives, our skin color, the land, or concrete we grew up on, our sexual longings, all fuse to create a political born out of necessity. Undoing the boundaries between the body and voice allows Black queer women writers both to represent the processes by which their voices are unwritten and develop new languages that can write against the erasure of their complex subjectivities, desires, and lives. So in Mecca Jamila Sullivan's essay about Ntozake Shange and choreo poetics, you can see how she relates choreo poetics to a rethinking of how we engage our bodies and in how we read our bodies, and how, in a sense, our bodies can be seen as a form of kind of poetics or literature, and how our bodies engage other bodies, engage the environments around us, is a form of kind of literature in of itself. And the words and grammars and languages we create only reflect that. So in thinking about the relationship between our bodies and the signs that our bodies form, uh, signs and symptoms of the body are not formed in a vacuum. So I would like for you all to create this kind of sensual mapping in thinking about James Baldwin's sensuality and Audre Lorde's the ideas around the erotic, and create your own kind of sensual mapping or constellation, as Amani Perry said. So to create your own that reveals how the environments in which you are in affect your own personal stories about and from your body. So before we run out of time, will be a takeaway prompt that you can work on your own, and the next prompt as well, to create your own kind of choreo poetic or concrete poetry. So concrete poetry is a form of poetry in which the poem takes the form of some sort of object or shape. So I would like for you all to develop a ritual poem of movements, actions, of values, like the values that Perry mentions. What you like, who you love, what makes you laugh, what rocks your spirit, what leaves you satisfied, what's useful information do you get from your feelings, what do you value most about yourself and those you love. And for all the bodies in which you engage, personal, physical, community, social body, environmental body, etc. And this poem can also take the shape of a physical form, as I mentioned, like in concrete poetry. So this is another prompt that you can take away for yourself to work on later as well. So before we end this workshop, I wanted to mention ways to re-engage your body beyond kind of um, thinking-based, conscious-based um, ways of therapy that we're often told is how therapy works. And instead thinking about how the body and movement of the body and touching of the body is a kind of entry point that should be considered for how we approach therapy. So thinking about soothing and comforting emotions, because the word emotion has to do with movement as well. So the first one I mentioned is stimming. People who are neurodivergent, especially those on the autism spectrum, they regularly do stimming, which is known as self-stimulating behaviors or stereotypy, and those are repeated body movements or repetitive movements of objects. So for example, I'm very fidgety because have basically ADHD, and so like constantly using fidget stuff, clicking of things to keep me, concentrating on what I need to concentrate on. Some other examples of movements are rocking back and forth, fidgeting movements, as I mentioned. Also, there's another term called neurogenic tremors, and that is something that is innate within our bodies and innate within the bodies of most mammals, that whenever we um, have trauma impacting our bodies, one of the best ways to deal with that trauma is to do some sort of shaking movement. Most mammals do this when they have a traumatic bodily experience. They will shake it off, or shake in a very wild kind of way in order to get that trauma or discharge that trauma and that excess buildup of energy out of their bodies. Other ways of dealing with trauma in the body is skin to skin contact. That can be with other people, that can be with yourself. So gentle patting, rubbing, massage, tapping techniques as well. Body movements like stretches, mudras, which it has to do with hand movements, yoga, dancing. There's choreographic embodied writing, so that's writing with the body and its movements as a focus, or writing with repetitive movements or ideas. Repeated affirmations or mantras. So, for example, using "You are your best thing," that gets mentioned at the end of Beloved. Communal rituals, regular kind of meetups and ceremonies that you do with the community, and other kinds of ritualized commitments to the task of unlearning old habits and redefining the self, as Imani Perry mentioned. So ways of mediating and interrogating your sense memory, your muscle memory, those reflexes created from your traumas and biases that you have. Unlearning those old habits and kind of redefining a new self that isn't your identity being based off of the traumatic experiences that you may have had. So the last takeaway prompt is the mothering touch, since Imani Perry's essay is about mothers and Black mothers. And when we think about mothering, I think it's important to go beyond the gendered idea of mothering, that other people can give you mothering as well. So, for example, in the end of Beloved, Paul D rocked Sethi back and forth and held her hands when she needed soothing and comfort after she felt she had lost her best thing, Beloved. So, the question I'm asking you is, in what ways do you need to be held? What needs do you wish others would be sensitive to, or ways you wish others in your community showed up for you in your life? So that is a takeaway prompt as well. Um, and to end, I want to share some resources. And first, we have Somatic Self Care from John Hopkins Medicine. And in that website, there's a list of resources of various somatic practices which you can use um, to help you re engage with your body and process traumas that you may have. Another source is Prentice Hill and the Embodiment Institute, and that is a Black centered somatics work institute created by Prentice Hill, who is one of the writers in the You Are Your Best Thing anthology. And then last, The Queer Body Remembers Somatic Focused Trauma Healing by Payam Gasemlu. And he talks about how therapy needs to be refocused from a kind of bottom up thinking where we focus more on the body and not so much on this conscious thinking, because so much of our body is not actually conscious, especially if you're thinking about the autonomic nervous system, where that's the part of the nervous system that doesn't even go through the brain. It stays centered in the spinal cord and the rest of the nerves of the body. And so to focus on other parts of the bodies, other parts of our body that goes beyond just our conscious thinking as well. And he also mentions as well how other animals also process trauma in their bodies through their bodies as well. So that's it for now. And I thank you for joining me for this workshop and all the previous workshops as well. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cherise. I think one of the things that I want to talk about, and I don't know if this is necessarily what they meant by these things, but the idea of like rememory and post memory, right? And the idea of, especially with post memory, where that mediation of taking our memories and like working through what we experienced. And I feel that like it's one of the things that I thought about was taking a memory that may have been represented through trauma or representative through some sort of adverse experience, and reframing that, right, by putting like our life together at the present time and putting that memory in our presence, right?
Mhm,
So instead of being stuck in the past with that memory of when the experience happened,
mhm,
reframing it in the present of, well, I've moved past that experience and
mhm,
I'm in a better place, and now I can think about that memory
mhm,
in this new place that isn't stuck in that like hurt and grief. And
mhm.
I'm not sure if that's exactly what they were trying to get at, but I would love to hear your take on that and how you would process post memory and rememory and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it, especially when we think of like PTSD and like how you tend to be stuck in the past so much so that you're not focusing on where you are right now.
Hmm.
And that's why one of the things I mentioned was the idea of body talk and body language and how we construct narratives, because sometimes we might be so lost in a certain time that we're not constructing the narrative around our life right now. And so we're not noticing the things that are helping us right now or the things that could help us right now. So like for me, a lot of the trauma I had growing up caused me to not be present in my own life. And so writing poetry or writing stories helped me to be aware of the things I have now that I could depend on and engage and interact with, that helped me to be more present in my life and also create a kind of gateway for me to move forward with my own life and actually to value my body and value who I am, where I am right now, and where I could be as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think, one of the things about, traditional therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, is that, like you were saying, it's very much about doing that process that you just described, but only mentally, right?
Mhm,
And there isn't that integration of what does this mean now that I'm not thinking in this negative pattern? What
mhm,
does that mean for my body, right?
mm,
Because if one of the things I used to say all the time to my therapist is that, like, intellectually I know this, but I still have, the tension
right.
in my shoulders or the tension in my chest.
Mhm,
And those are all things that, like you're saying, we don't control that. That's a body response. And,
mhm,
what is the way that we can take it so that our body informs what's
mm,
going on, in our cognitions, but also using our cognitions to inform what's going on in our body.
right. 'Cause, like, so much of that is habits and reflexes our body, develops, like, the whole, like, if you touch something hot, you'll flinch, so
Mhm.
every time you feel something hot, you flinch, right? Our bodies have so much muscle memory that, it's a lot to unpack. So, for example, I hold a lot of tension in my jaw and my shoulders, and one thing I've been doing recently is, like I mentioned, neurogenic tremors, where I will shake my shoulders a lot to, like, remove a lot of that tension, or, like, even with my tongue, I will wiggle my tongue back and forth to remove that tension in my jaw. So a lot of that is kind of removing a lot of those habits and tensions that my body developed.
Mhm. Yeah, that's amazing. And it's funny you saying that. It reminds me of when I, was training for singing. A lot of the times to remove draw attention, they would tell you to move your tongue back and forth as you're
Mhm,
singing
mhm,
because it does that also. So it's taking things from outside and integrating it into our lives through our own self-care can be really impactful.
mhm.
So I just want to say thank you so much, Cherise, for staying with us for a whole year. This was a great series. Everyone loved it. I certainly loved it, and I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you had a great Wednesday. Please stay safe with all this wildfire smoke going around. Please take care of yourselves, and we'll see you at our next Wellness Wednesday. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.